From the Juggernaut, welcome to ITV Gold again, Snigdha. I hope you're doing well today.
Aditi, thanks for having us and having me.
Of course, it was important to get you back because we are talking about this historic election which just took place and we're still trying to deal with what's happening. So let's dig right into it, Snigdha. My first question to you has to be, what has been your and your team's reaction to this entire historic cycle of election? How was it covering it?
Yes, I mean, it was so important covering it. Many of people on our team and our reporters didn't really even think that in our lifetimes we'd see somebody of Asian American descent, we'd see a woman vice president, we'd see someone of Black descent become vice president. Like, these are all these firsts that Kamala Harris just broke through in terms of barriers. So in terms of reporting on it, we knew immediately, as soon as she was even running for the presidency, that she was someone to follow. So that, I think, was definitely established from the beginning. What made it interesting that once she was announced on the ticket, we still continued reporting on her. And what our reporters are finding in the field, obviously, is there are so many mixed emotions at the same time. So many people are so excited to see her. And it's true. She said she won't be the last. She might be the first, but she won't be the last. And so many young women, non-young women are so excited to see somebody like her at the second highest position in political office in the US. Right. At the same time, our reporters also found a lot of other reactions, right? Because when you spend a long time in history, as Hillary Clinton's candidacy showed, and maybe because she's also a female politician, you're just held to a higher standard. Kind of your entire history is really looked at with a magnifying lens. A lot of past records are looked at. And at the same time, there have been moments where she has had a few gaffes in both the Black and the Indian community. So that's been kind of interesting to report on as well.
How do you think South Asians reacted to the Biden-Harris ticket, according to you, with whatever information you were able to gather?
So, it's great because we also looked at this amazing Carnegie survey called the Indian American Attitude Survey. This survey surveyed about 936 Indian American citizens in the US right before the election. And what the survey found was that 49% of those respondents actually were more enthusiastic about the Biden ticket after he selected Harrison as his vice president. And the number one reason among those 49% for why they were more enthusiastic about his presidency was because she was of Indian origin. And so there is a change, and there was a change that happened in the entire candidacy because of that ticket and because of that pick.
Yes, definitely. Let's talk a little bit more about this historic election again. I would like to know, how was it covering the battleground states? Because at the end of the day, it all relied on those four states. Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. What were some of the discoveries you and your team found?
Yes. So when you think about those, sometimes they're called swing states. Sometimes they're called the states that had very, very small margin of victory. Right. One of our reporters specifically is actually from the Philadelphia area, and she went around and spoke to what she called a lot of aunties and uncles, as well as the young folks from Pennsylvania. And it's interesting because ahead of time, people already kind of knew from the 2016 results that Pennsylvania would be very, very important. And you've seen also this kind of uprising of tons of grassroots organizations created by South Asians, also affiliated with the South Asians for Biden campaign, that were really out there canvassing, campaigning, phone banking to get the vote out there, and to also, get people to register, to get people to kind of show up to vote, to, let people know about mail-in ballots, to let people know about policies and from both kind of sides of the aisle, from both the Republican and the Democratic side. So I think it was really important at all of those states for all of those efforts to happen. Right. And I think when you think about those campaigns, so many people are realizing that, the Electoral College is not necessarily a flawed system, but it is partly sometimes an outdated system, which means that certain states matter much more than you would think. When you look at the South Asian American population, most have settled in a lot of the eastern or western regions, or a lot of the cities. And so what you're increasingly seeing is that states that are like Georgia, which have Atlanta, or states like Pennsylvania, which have Philadelphia, increasingly have South Asian American voters, and they could be swinging the elections.
Yes, for sure. We actually heard that, there were about 2.5 million South Asian Americans eligible to vote in swing states as well, and I'm sure they made a huge difference. I would like to ask you this, and I have to ask anybody that's a member of press here. Have you projected Joe Biden as the winner of this election?
That's a very interesting question. So one, I think everybody in the media has kind of learned the folly of trying to project the winner after the 2016 election. Early polls can often be very misleading. And even, this time around, it seems like we ended up being okay, but it's still, the polls were a bit misleading. There are some heuristics people do follow. So one thing to think about is this was a historic election because it broke, according to Bloomberg, the 60% voter participation rate barrier. And that's never happened before in recent decades. Usually, if you look back in the past few elections, it's been closer to anywhere from 50 to 55%. Breaking 60%, people are projecting it's going to be 68 to 72%. When you see those kind of numbers, many people, especially in the policy world, project that it's most likely going to be a Democratic winner. Why? Because some people believe that a lot of voter rules, like you can't write in blue ink, you have to write in black ink, you can't do this, you have to go there, are often there, some people believe, to suppress voters. There's actually proof of that out there. So when you saw those numbers coming in, I think a lot of people felt much more comfortable projecting the elections. And I think that's why the AP, the Associated Press, even felt comfortable calling the election because of some of those statistics and because they could see some of those counties getting, counted and knowing that, other parties couldn't make up that difference.
Yes, definitely. We are referring to him as president-elect, just like many other TV networks, because it was predicted that, President Donald Trump is refusing to concede, Snigdha, and he has called on voter fraud. He's claiming lawsuits. My question to you is, since your team was on the field, have you discovered any evidence of voter fraud?
Oh man, that's such a difficult question to answer. I would say that from the reporters in our reporting team and what they found, frankly, I don't think they found that. I think when they were talking to so many people who had voted or wanted, that really didn't come up. It wasn't like, hey, I got 2 ballots and I put in 2. Like that never, ever really came up among the population based on what we know. Again, we are sampling a very limited population, as you said, at the 2.5 million voters. So no, I really don't think there could be voter fraud from our reporting specifically. And on top of that, I think you have to observe what's also going on with the specific Trump administration. According to certain reporting, many members of his own administration are very reticent to even call it voter fraud because they know they'll have to rely on this very same process in 2024 if Trump chooses to run again.
Yes, that's so true. There is a growing number of Republicans that are pushing President Trump to allow access to classified briefings to Joe Biden. Do you think that will help, Snigdha?
Well, I mean, the way to think about it is, I think when it comes to the current presidency and classified information, I think it's been a coin toss. So I don't have further comment or more reporting on that than what we've seen in the media, but I'll leave it at that. What I also would say, is interesting at this time around is that I really want to underline that the South Asian American vote isn't a monolith. So when you look at certain data, and we have to really be careful here, that data is so limited. The most data there is on Indian Americans, which make up 80% of the South Asian American vote. There will be more data forthcoming. But so far, what it's really found is that the support for Biden and the support for Trump really vary by religion. They vary by age group. They can vary by whether you're a recent immigrant or a U.S.-born citizen or a more or less recent immigrant. And I think that's something really important to remember, that there is no monolithic group. But the data shows that South Asian Americans are one of the most reliably Democratic votes after Black Americans.
Snigdha, in your discoveries with the election coverage, what topics did you think mattered the most to South Asians?
What we found got the most read in terms of our reportage was sometimes the surprising stuff. So I'll give you an example. When we go back to how South Asians are in a monolith, this Indian American attitude survey showed that the biggest proportion of religious group that supported the Republican Party was actually Indian American Christians. They're a very small group, but over 40% of them, 45% of them supported a Republican president. And that's a kind of a little known fact that most people don't think about. And of course, the survey could be limited, but when we published an article digging into why that is, so many other issues came up, and it was a lens to look at other issues. Like, for example, the Republican Party has espoused more Christian values over time, such as anti-abortion platforms and things like that. And those do matter for people who identify with that religion. There were also Indian American Christians who said that they felt they related more to their church than even their own, South Asian community because of different forms of discrimination. And I think those things are really important to uncover. The other thing that really resonated among our readership, and also things that we were uncovering with the reporting, are the complicated feelings about a Harris vice presidency, about Harris in general, but also about Biden, Harris, and Trump. We have to not forget that there are people who might support Biden and support Modi. There might be people who support Biden and don't support Modi. There is just a lot of context and nuance there. And I think whenever you kind of uncover some of those surprising facts and dig deeper into the why and not just the numbers, that's been very kind of interesting for our audience.
And what's more interesting is the fact that Prime Minister Narendra Modi has officially congratulated President-elect Joe Biden on Twitter, I believe, and he's openly welcomed him to India and a greater foreign relationship. Snigdha, this is going to be by far the toughest transition process. Just looking at the mere fact that, a president-elect doesn't have access to anything in the White House. But do you think Joe Biden's team is doing a good job at laying out its own platform, at its own mandate? Do you think that message is clear of them to the public?
I think the biggest word that people felt with the results of these elections, and again, we'll know when January rolls around and inauguration happens. Yeah. The biggest word I've heard across the board from our sources and our reporters and everyone around you is relief, right? That's the biggest word. They feel as if, there's a sense of relief. And I think what's interesting here is this might have been an election where a lot of people were not choosing something, if that makes sense. They weren't necessarily opting for something, they were choosing not something. And when that happens, I think the Biden and Harris team is kind of putting together their policies. And a lot of the early policies that are coming out seem to be, from my understanding of what the media is reporting and what the transition team is reporting, a lot of undoing of a lot of what has happened during the Trump presidency, bringing back certain Affordable Care Act benefits, bringing back certain things that, were done away with. And I think that's also interesting in terms of the policy mandate. I think they're going to have a huge policy mandate in front of them in terms of international relations as well. You pointed out Modi did open up and accept the results. And I think that's also interesting because Modi and Trump, they both spoke at the Howdy Modi rally. And if you actually really parse those speeches, they might be more frenemies than we think they are, if that makes sense. And so I think, Modi's just interested in having good relations with the US, regardless of who's in power. And I think that'll be interesting to watch as well in terms of how the US repairs some of its international relations, because basically the Trump presidency moved us out of a lot of international agreements during his 4 years.
Definitely. In terms of looking at the next 2 months, Snigdha, what are you going to be following the most?
Some of the things that our audience is really excited to look into is also immigration policy. So we're going to be looking into a lot about what the Biden-Harris transition team is going to say about immigration. There were a lot of things happening, from separating parents and children at borders to, delaying visas. And because of the COVID pandemic, which has made everything worse, COVID will be also a top thing that people are really looking to see what this presidency will do. And that's really important because we're seeing this, recent uptick in COVID cases.
Right.
So I think the big question in everybody's mind is this Democratic presidency going to be different than what's happened in the prior 4 years? Hopefully everyone's thinking a resounding yes, but I think a lot of people are really going to watch out about what those plans are, and we're going to be following them pretty closely as well.
And just looking at COVID-19, Snigdha, do you see our community, the South Asian American community, being impacted heavily by it, disproportionately impact?
So again, going back to there not being that much data, what's really interesting is even in the US specifically, they weren't even reporting by Asian American versus other racial groups, or even breaking down that Asian American to South Asian American and East Asian American, for example. So in the US specifically, data has been quite limited. What's interesting is across the pond, our British brothers and sisters and all of them have actually had more data and done more studies on South Asians. And what they found is that South Asian Brits, once they do get COVID, somehow have many more complications. And the current thesis is maybe because many South Asians have higher, risk rates for diabetes, heart disease, lung issues. And so once someone does get COVID, what the British study found is there could be a higher impact. In the US, there's still such limited data. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is some disproportionate impact there. The second thing our reporting found, apart from the health impact, is that many South Asian Americans, are on the front lines. They can be our Uber drivers or Lyft drivers or our taxi cab drivers. They can be the people in the ER as our nurses or our doctors or, even medical practitioners or in our clinics. And so when you look at it from that perspective, because South Asians are overrepresented in a lot of those fields, there's also been a high impact there, especially early on when there were a lot of cases. Many South Asians just contracted it much more than you would expect there.
Snigdha, President-elect Joe Biden has said that he's specifically making coronavirus pandemic as a priority for his incoming administration. How much of that weight do you think coronavirus has right now in politics?
COVID is so important to politics right now. I mean, it's not only important to politics, it's affected every single aspect of our lives, including the economy, right? When Pfizer announced that it might have a 90% efficacious vaccine, the stock market just changed, right? Like certain stocks that were performing poorly started doing better. Tech stocks took a little bit of a dive. And I think that's really important to remember that COVID is changing so quickly in terms of the status in the US that it will be one of the most critical things in terms of the next year. It could even determine whether this lasts for another year or whether this lasts for 6 more months, right? We don't really know. And it's going to really impact the country at large.
Yeah, Snigdha, I have a statement here. I would love your comment on it. It says that this election has shown the very divided nation across racial, socioeconomic, and religious lines. Do you believe this? And also, what did you find on this?
Yes, that's a very good question. And I would say that at the end of the day, most groups are kind of reacting in completely different ways. And let me explain this with a much more specific example. The data has shown that Trump did make gains among young Black and Hispanic voters. And that was, quote unquote, an unexpected result because, some people felt that, and rightly so, that this presidency has been, prone to racist remarks and all of that stuff. And so those data points have been very surprising when you read them. And so when you really think about it, what does it mean to have a divided country? I would say that the country has probably been divided for a really long time when it comes to having a two-party system. And what we need to figure out is that there have been people who have experienced completely different outcomes in their lives. And that really hasn't changed. I think a lot of people right now are talking about the inequality in the country when it comes to socioeconomic inequality. And that might be driving part of this polarization because everyone has a different solution to that problem, right? For some governments, it's cutting taxes and making sure it trickles down to the rest of the economy. For others, certain, usually more democratic governments, it's, hey, demand side recovery. We need to give out stimulus packages. We need to help people in need. And I think that's what's creating a lot of division right now in terms of, hey, we have a crisis. How do we solve it?
Snigdha, this summer saw protests like none other in this nation. And I'm talking about the Black Lives Matter movement. My question to you is, in your findings, did you find an interaction between the BLM movement and the elections, especially favoring the Democratic side? Do you think, that movement sort of pushed more towards favoring the Democratic candidate at that time?
Oof, that's such a hard question to project in terms of polling and information. What I will say is that the Black Lives Matter movement really showed people how important it is that change has not happened. And I think it made people realize that regardless of whatever happens in terms of the next presidency, the standards are really high in terms of people still expect more. Whether it is a Biden-Harris presidency, which it looks like it will be, or whether it is a Trump presidency, which we don't think it will be, people are expecting much more in terms of justice. They're expecting much more in change of behavior. Even after, the summer movement and the summer protests, there were still incidents that happened. People still died. Breonna Taylor still has not gotten justice. And I think that's something important to remember, that something that the population has learned is that they feel like it's just not enough. And I think that's why you're seeing people like in the squad in Congress asking for more. And so I don't think that conversation by any means is over. And I don't think that regardless of whether it's a Democratic or Republican presidency, I don't really think that either of them have historically yet completely really addressed this hugely systemic injustice, and that they're going to be watched on that.
Snigdha, in your findings, how much of this impacted the South Asian voice this year?
A lot. I think Black Lives Matter, if it didn't impact somebody, that's a question, why did it not impact somebody, I would say. And when we were looking into our reporting, we used this as a moment to report on what brown people were feeling. We used it as a moment to reflect back on history when there was much more solidarity between the Black and South Asian community. We used it as a moment to reflect on racism and anti-Blackness in the South Asian community. We looked at it as a moment to reflect forward and think about where we want these relations to go and how this community can support each other. And I think that's really important. So I think it was a really important moment in history, and I hope it's not just a one-time moment, but it is hopefully a constant questioning of how all these histories intersect across all of our lives and why we are where we are today. So yes, it definitely affects the South Asian community. It affects the model minority myth. Immigration has been selected for our community after 1965. It does impact our lived experiences and how we think of ourselves and think of ourselves in our standing in the US as well.
Snigdha, I just have two more questions left for you. The first one has to be about what insight could you and your journalists give us about what's happening at the Capitol? We also saw all 4 Indian American U.S. representatives being elected again into the U.S. Congress. But what are you seeing there right now? How is the level of tension there?
So I can't comment on the level of tension in Washington, but what I can comment is on those South Asian American races.
Right.
So this year, one of our reporters pointed out that there were more South Asians than ever before historically running for congressional races, both the Senate and Congress. And I think that's really fascinating when it comes, and the House of Representatives. And I think that's really important in terms of shifting dynamics, in terms of who thinks what is possible. I think the disappointing outcome, of course, of the 2016 election so far has been all the people who won, the South Asian Americans who won, specifically are Indian American, and they're also specifically incumbents. And so that was a really interesting fact that there were several tight races where South Asians were, some of them were projected to win and they didn't ultimately. And I think people were hoping to see, a bigger South Asian American push. But hey, there's another election in 2 years, so we'll see what happens there. I think that'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah.
Many South Asian Americans also won a lot of state assemblies, which doesn't lead to DC, but those are some of the trends we're seeing.
Yeah, we saw the first South Asian American assemblywoman of South Asian descent being elected just here in New York State, with another South Asian male, Zoran, being elected again at the state assembly. My final question to you has to be your path moving forward, Snigdha. I know you have to educate the audience on COVID-19 even more with these surges coming up now, and you must be focused on what to do after these elections. So what is the focus? What are you laying out as your plan?
Yes. When it comes to the media, we just are a mirror to society and we're pushing the conversation forward. So in terms of our focus for the rest of this quarter and for 2021, we're gearing up for much more political coverage. So be prepared for that. We are definitely probably having an entire staff writer dedicated specifically to the BidenHarris transition team, their policies, all of that good stuff. So political coverage will definitely increase a lot. The second thing we're looking out for, of course, is COVID coverage. And I think the third thing we're looking out for is some of those things that have just been happening in terms of the economy, in terms of business. We have to remember that more and more South Asian Americans are part of the everyday lives of business as well, from tech to from Google and all of those companies. And so I think what we're looking forward to for 2020 and 2021 is keeping that pulse going. But definitely politics, COVID-19 are probably two of the most foremost topics that people are curious about, and information is constantly changing.
Snigdha, I wish you and your team at Juggernaut the best of luck as you continue to do this coverage, and I hope to get you back here on ITV Gold. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me. Stay well.
Of course, stay healthy.